Welcome to the Vinyl Verdict. I've got with me Bob Rodriguez, longtime Badfinger fan, going all the way back to the No Matter What fanzines, and even before that, which we'll get into. The host of the Something About the Beatles podcast, an amazing resource, and recently had Bob Jackson on there for an incredible 90-minute interview. So thanks for being here, Bob.
It's my pleasure. It's cool to talk Badfinger. It seems like lately we've been on this Badfinger roll. Sadly, with the loss of Joey, but interest is still there. Head first is a good thing to sort of spearhead kicking that door open again. So I'm just happy that this conversation is happening.
Absolutely, and thanks for doing your part to usher in kind of the golden age of all this Badfinger material. And I know you've also got a new book out, Ribbons of Rust, Volume 1 on the Beatles. Do you want to tell us, maybe since that's topical, a little bit about the process of writing that and where folks can get it?
So Jerry Hammack is a guy who by trade was a musician and is a producer and engineer. And he wrote a 5-volume series of books, the Beatles Reference Recording Manual series, a nice wieldy name there. But it was 5 volumes covering their entire EMI years. And basically anything you want to know in the studio, because we've got more data that's come out since Lewison did his recording sessions book, and even the Beatles book came out. So anything you want to know about that history in the studio, he's got covered through the ears and eyes of an engineer producer. So we became friends, and it occurred to him that his weak point is everything that happened outside the studio. Well, what informed the making of these records? What were they going for? Who were they competing against, et cetera, et cetera? And history is totally my wheelhouse as far as, not just Beatles, but rock and roll, 50s, 60s, 70s, all that stuff. So it made sense to join forces where he would put down a more reader-friendly, non-technical history of the inside the recording studio stuff, while I would build out that history around outside of it. And I thought that, well, if we're going to start at square one, let's take it way back. Now, his books start at 62 with Love Me Do. I thought going back 8 years to July of 1954 was a lot more useful, because that's where you had the convergence of Skiffle, Rock and Roll with Elvis. Literally within a fortnight of Lonnie Donegan recording Rock Island Line, you had Elvis recording That's All Right Mama, its son. And that same month, you had the end of wartime rationing. In 1954, 14 years after Britain entered the war, they ended the rationing. So suddenly, kids who'd come of age, been born in 39, 40, are now teenagers. They're 14 years old, 13 years old. They're now free to buy these things that they couldn't before, which includes guitars and records, and just they have disposable income. And they're really chafing at the bit at coming up with their own social and cultural identity apart from their parents. So rock and roll and skiffle landed exactly the right time. So that's the story of how instruments got put in the hands of the Beatles and that entire generation, and how it just rocked their world, and what made that particular group of individuals, John, Paul, George, and Ringo, so exceptional alongside their peers doing the same thing. Lots of bands went to Hamburg, only one came back to Beatles. So that's what we're exploring. And they didn't create in a vacuum. They were as influenced, as impacted as everything going around them. So we try to put the readers in the 1950s Britain and early 60s. Lots of color, and the book comes replete with QR codes that if you're reading something about Donegan or Eddie Cochran or Little Richard or whatever, put your phone on the QR code. It'll take you right to that song, so you can hear exactly what we're talking about. And there's lots of periodical covers and album covers and all that stuff. So if we did our job right, you will be transported. And that's the story we wanted to tell, is to see the world through their eyes.
Yeah, no, that sounds amazing. And I think for many of us, right, the Beatles story has been extremely formative on our lives. And we forget how this period from 1954 to 1963 was so formative on everything that they would do and their characters. So I think
And
that's
Badfinger's
great.
a little bit younger, but they're listening to and being wowed and impacted by the same stuff.
Oh, yeah.
So imagine that, especially, ultimately the two guys in the band from Liverpool. Liverpool, it was very advantaged, as I researched in the book, not just the fairy tale of the Cunard Yanks bringing in the American rock and roll records. That's been a little bit overplayed. More directly, rock and roll was being broadcast from the continent on Radio Luxembourg. And because of the way the radio waves bounced through the air, Northern England, Liverpool, got a much better signal than did the kids in London and
Mm.
Southern England. So they had that leg up, which is a cool thing not many people talk about.
because you mentioned it, everyone's going to be thinking about, kind of Mark Lewison is the expert out there or whatever on this period. What are maybe some of those like differences in the narrative or kind of additional sources that you included maybe that might subvert that?
Well, there's things that were surprising along the way that we either uncovered and then followed down the rabbit hole. Like, for instance, ever since Anthology came out, I think most Beatle fans are aware, as of 1995, that when they were still the Quarrymen, they went down to this sort of ad hoc recording studio in Liverpool run by Percy Phillips, who would record in this one room, a few microphones around, and you would get an acetate record out of it. And you could take it home, do whatever you wanted with it. And the Beatles, the Quarrymen, did that with a cover of That'll Be the Day by Buddy Holly and the Crickets, and an original song called In Spite of All the Danger. And so those got issued on the anthology back in 1995. What we were able to confirm was that was not their first trip there. They went back a couple years later in early 1960. John, Paul, and George, the Quarrymen had kind of fallen apart by then. They're right on the cusp of getting Stuart Sutcliffe into the band. And of all the songs for them to record, it was one that sort of traces the arc of their career as Beatles that they only really nailed at the end, which is One After 909, an early song John wrote. They tried to do a studio take in 63, failed, but had been part of their sets at least as far back as 1960. He had always said he wrote it when he was 17, which would be 1957, but it was a very early song that they could never quite get a handle on. And now we spoke to Percy Phillips' grandson, who runs things now. He said, yes, it is true. It's part of the family lore. However, no copy is known to exist anymore. And the logbook we had for that month, it disappeared somewhere. And so we can't give you the smoking gun. But we as a family are well aware that's what happened, and I can verify that for you. So
makes a lot of sense. I always wonder when they whip that out in the Get Back sessions. It's like, really, this is just from me to you side? Like, there must be more history behind this if they're so familiar with it to take it out.
Yeah, there absolutely is. Yeah, for sure. And it turns up on, we cover in a great bit of detail the tapes they did at Paul's house on Fortland Road in the spring of 1960. It turns up there. So that's like the first documentation of it, along with originals like Hello Little Girl and I'll Follow the Sun. So you see the Quarrymen, as they're sort of transitioning into what becomes first the Silver Beatles and then the Beatles, these original songs that ultimately would surface in the versions that we know. So it's a great marker of their true intentions. And that's really one of the theses of the book, is that they didn't set out to be a performing band. Performing was sort of ancillary to achieving their goals of, we want a recording contract, we want to make a record, ideally a hit record, right? But unlike, say, a Bob Dylan, who he goes into the studio, bashes out his stuff, puts out a record, his material comes to life on stage. It's something that you constantly will amend and rethink and reshape. Where the Beatles, when they were playing once they became a hit-making band, they'd pretty much replicate the record on stage. To them, the record was the point, not the live performance. So that's a distinction that I think people should be aware of as to their true intentions. So as long as they had the ideal before them of getting a recording contract, when they first connected, Paul was writing songs, John was writing songs. For efficiency's sake and also for raising the bar, let's write together. Once they got into the Hamburg circuit, and there was no immediate need because nobody in a club was interested in their original material. Nobody. They wanted to hear hits. They wanted to dance. They wanted to get drunk, whatever. That, I don't care about Love Me Do. Who cares about that? Not until Brian sends them the wire while they're in Hamburg that EMI is requesting a recording date. Rehearse new material. Get back on that horse. The thing you've been waiting for has finally happened. And you'd asked about Lewison and something that new that we'd come up with. One of the things I wanted to point out is that, as exhaustive and detailed, and not to take a thing away from Lewison, he's put together this incredible history, but it's like there's not just one go-to historian for World War II either. It's like you can collect the data and come up with your interpretation. But one of the things that I thought went unexplained in Tune In, even the voluminous, huge one, is we're told that they got brought to Parlophone because people in the publishing there were interested in John and Paul as songwriters, having heard from the Decca tape, Love of the Loved, Hello Little Girl, third original song, I can't think of it right this moment. But anyway, why then, once EMI gets them under contract, were those songs never revisited? that's what intrigued you to begin with, and you shunt them aside. Second, George Martin is trying to shove down their throat, how do you do it, for their first record written by Mitch Murray, which is not under EMI publishing.
Mm.
So we're told it's about the publishing, but that's a gaping hole in the narrative there. So clearly there's more to the history than we've been able to uncover. And all we can do is do our best. But it's always a mistake to establish something as fact if you don't have every bit of data in place to back that up. And even then, sometimes the worst witnesses are the people that were there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and sometimes it is just pulling on a thread and seeing which one actually leads to something. So I think
Exactly.
it's great that you're examining it that way. Will there be a volume two?
Oh, yes. We've got now the busy year. We've taken people, the readers on this trip. How did they get interested in making music? Well, a couple of them already were dabbling in music. George got fixated on guitars once he saw a picture of Slim Whitman on a magazine cover, and then suddenly rock and roll and skiffle hit. It gave you a roadmap to becoming a practitioner yourself, and it just rocked the world. Ringo, same thing. The sickly kid with no real future. He found he had a talent for drums. He had a talent for performing once he joined his first skiffle band. So all this stuff coalesces. So we bring them to the point of 2 hit singles. And now the success of the second single is paving the way for EMI to say, okay, you guys can make an album now. We're just going to give you one day to do it. So that's what happens on February 11th, 63. So the next volume picks up from that, runs to the end of the year, by which time you've now got 2 hit albums that trade places at #1 on top of the British chart that year. All these high profile gigs, including before the Royals and the British equivalent of the Ed Sullivan Show, Sunday night at the London Palladium. International success. They tour Sweden and just knock them on their heads there.
Yeah, some of the best shows I've ever heard are on that suite. I mean,
oh my God, so tight. That's years of club muscle manifesting itself in crystal clear recordings. Yeah. And so they're just poised now to conquer America. But because we're focusing on the recordings, yeah, there's 2 albums and X how many singles, but there's a ton of BBC recordings that year. And it seems like every other month, a new 63 recording is surfacing.
So I was going to ask you about that. What's your perspective on why those are coming up 60 years later, and what do they maybe reveal, even in the kind of low fidelity that they're emerging from attics and whatever out there in England?
Right. It just leads you to think that things that maybe we didn't think were documented are, as people are, these living witnesses to those times are dying off, and then their kids are going through their stuff. It's like, well, what's this tape Grandpa had in this attic, reel to reel? That stuff is likely to happen more and more, which gives me hope for Badfinger's autumn tour of the UK. Somebody was running a tape on those shows. Oh, I hope to God, but we'll see. Part of me was thinking, well, if this was to happen in 2013, I could see explosion of 50 years running out of copyright. Suddenly the stuff that EMI can't claim is coming out. But we're past that point. It's exactly the right point in history, because now we've got the AI to clean up that stuff. And I hope they start with the Star Club. That's
a good point. Do you remember there was a period where Apple started dumping 1963 recordings for like an hour at midnight when the copyright expired, and then they took it back, I think, just so they could claim that they had publishing on it. So I don't know what happened, and that never happened for any other year. But I think they were testing something from a legality perspective, and they found that actually it's not going to expire, I assume, right?
Well, they didn't repeat it, so it must not be. But then you see all these gray market releases of like their early material, like Love Me Do and the Tony Sheridan stuff and things like that. So until there's a court fight over it, I think it's still the Wild West. And as long as something's not selling by the zillions, it's not going to bother me.
Yeah. So maybe rewinding a little bit, I want to get into a couple questions. Easy to get on tangents because I do love chatting about this stuff, and you are quite an expert. Let's go into your story, though, and kind of where did the spark come for your interest in the Beatles and then Badfinger?
With Beatles, the gateway drug was the Red and Blue albums. I can trace my fandom back to the release of those in '73. By year's end, I think I'd asked for one for Christmas, and then with my own money, I bought the other. So
which one did you get first? That's the question.
I got the Red album as a gift, and then the Blue album was like, I have to have this. I can't, you can't leave me hanging at 66. I got to have it all. But it was exposure through a music teacher at school that, we're talking grade school or whatever it was, that when you have that music class back in the day when they would sort of educate you on things. Besides singing folk songs in class or teaching the recorder, at least this teacher, we did a unit on classical music, and then you know, the Beatles had barely passed out of existence when those two albums arrived, and she used them as a teaching aid. I just remember being blown away at the scope. I was aware of Beatles, but I didn't have a real sense of what was Beatles and what wasn't. For example, I knew the song Uncle Albert from radio play. In
Oh,
my head, I thought it was a Beatle track because it sounds like a Beatle track, but I didn't like go out and buy the record. But I didn't have it really clearly delineated. It was all of a piece, to put it one way. And then being a pretty big reader, looking for books on the Beatles, especially ones that were worth anything, you can count them on one hand at the time I became a fan. And it was everything from Hunter Davies, which I remember some neighbors of us had on their shelves, but they didn't want to let me borrow it because, well, language. We don't want your parents getting mad at us because there's F bombs
yeah,
there.
that was before Paul came up with the official narrative. I think he was a little,
Right.
closer then. Yeah.
But Longest Cocktail Party was one of the first things I read. And then eventually,
That was one of
they
the
have it.
first. That's one of the most technical books out there. I still can barely get through some of that.
But it's funny because when you're a kid and you're used to reading certain type of stuff, I mean, as a memoir, and it's impressionistic. It's not linear.
Mhm.
It's his impressions of working Apple, Richard DeLello, and Badfinger. There's literally a picture in that book. I'm sure you've seen, captioned "Badfinger: The Musical Heroes of the Longest Cocktail Party," and so that, I think, if you need a smoking gun to point to as putting me on the Badfinger trail, it would have been that. He's got Bilello took, as your listeners know, the gatefold of No Dice and the cover up straight up. And so his championing them at a time when, you'd be at the mercy of radio playing one of their hits to really know what they're about. But by the time I'd satiated myself by getting all the Capitol albums and the few odd imports, and then eventually I pivoted into getting the bootlegs, which in those days you could find advertised in the back of the classifieds of Rolling Stone. Going to record stores and going through the cutout bins, suddenly there was Badfinger stuff, all these Apple releases, and conspicuously Straight Up was not there. That was the really hard one to find for the longest time. But Magic Christian Music, No Dice, and Ass, and then eventually the Warner albums as well. You could find in cutout bins. I remember my first copy of Magic Christian had the hype sticker on it for Come and Get It. These, wherever they'd been sitting, they were fresh off the 1970 printing plant. So I got these later in the 70s. I got them all, didn't really have a context for them. And I remember I was going to the library. I would just for fun go through the back issues of Rolling Stone. And it was at some point after 1975 that I found out Pete Ham had died, but it's right up there. So I found that out after I'd already become a fan. And, there was certainly not any books. But then when the advanced press started coming for airwaves, it was super exciting. It's like, okay, Badfinger is coming back. It's Joey and Tommy, no Mike, but well, at least it's something. So that was an album. That was the first Badfinger album I bought in real time because I was a fan by March of '79. And I was quite happy with it.
What was your impression of the album when you first heard it?
So I was working at a record store when Airwaves came out, and I remember the singles being released because I bought them in real time. Just being a completist and a collector, I wanted to have everything, and I got them, and I kept look at the Billboard charts to see if they were bubbling under or where they were, hoping and expecting. Because I remember even to my young years thinking the song "Sympathy," which is very danceable, surely that's going to be the single. Surely that's going to be the thing that gets them on the radio, even if it's kind of hold your nose disco. Yuck, we don't like that. But I liked it okay.
Yeah.
And it just seemed like that was its only reason for being in existence. So what happened? I
Yeah.
didn't understand. And then I think there was a Trouser Press article about Badfinger that filled in. It was sort of like the predecessor of Dan Manavid's book that laid out the whole story of Badfinger, because to that point, you were at the mercy of whatever periodic articles would pop up like a Rolling Stone, which wasn't many. And so that filled in some gaps. And I remember a couple issues later reading the letters going back about that article. I remember one in particular, some guy, I think he was in Texas, saying, "Oh, I saw Joey playing a gig here as Badfinger. It was him and two other guys, and it didn't go well or something like that." So whatever Tommy would think of that, it was just
Hmm.
you were very hard pressed to get any kind of organized information. I think that was part of the motivation for wanting to do the fanzine. Is like there should be some kind of clearinghouse for this stuff, get the word out that they want out, and organize the history because there was nothing. And we would get promos all the time from Warner Electro Atlantic, and of course, Radio Records was the subdivision. So we got that album in. I just remember my initial impression, expecting something as lushly produced as Airwaves. This was not that. But at the same time, being somebody who was really into punk and new wave and a lot of stuff out of England, it was very much a power pop creature. And I was into that stuff, everything from Shoes, the records. There was an American band called 2020. So I was already listening to that stuff anyway. The beats, Paul Collins beats. So hearing this guitars and a bit of keyboard, but it's piano, not an orchestration in sight, and a lot of it is driving upbeat rock and roll stuff. There's some ballads there too. It caught me by surprise, but I liked it. I thought this is great. Now, I was seeing concerts by then, but I hadn't. You're at there's no internet, so you're at the mercy of what you catch in like the local music press. We had something here called the Illinois Entertainer, which was a I don't know if it was weekly or monthly. I can't remember now. I think it was a monthly that would post all the bands, upcoming bands coming through town stuff. It wasn't until I want to say September of '83 that I caught in the calendar there for, of all places, the Thirsty Whale, which at that point was like a hair band club. It was up and coming, not Badfinger type bands. And I thought, Badfinger's coming on the Saturday night. So I went there. So ostensibly they were promoting Say No More because they did quite a bit of material. I brought my copy that night and got it signed by everybody in the band, Bob and Tommy. And but they were doing stuff from their entire career. And this was something I reminded Bob when I talked to him off the air that there were a few things that stayed with me that night. One was when they did Come and Get It, and they get to that breakdown in the song "Fool and His Money." Then it started going. Da, 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 da. It went into Money, the Barrett Strong song at that point.
Wow.
Yeah, and Tony Kaye's on stage, and that's like the year 90125 comes out. I couldn't believe it. I also remember that night they did "I Saw Her Standing There," which was interesting.
One of those has been published too. I know they put it up on the YouTube channel from that tour, and it sounds great. I mean, it's like the best Beatles cover of that song. Tom Evans, I mean, was so influenced by the Cavern Club days. You can hear it. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Did you ever see back when the 100 Davies book came out and the Beatles from that Mad Day Out cover of Life magazine, they excerpted it, and in the spread, and there's a photo taken in the Cavern in Liverpool. It's the Ivies on stage.
Yeah, I don't remember that particular picture, but I know, I mean, there's a picture of them in front of the Cavern and then playing on the stage. Yeah, I mean, they were in the shadows a couple years behind everything they did.
Yeah. Cool stuff. So I guess that night I went there expecting to see the Say No More band, and it was obvious that Joey wasn't there. And, you don't want to ask the question, well, where's Joey? But Bob Jackson was there. I remembered him, didn't know who he was, but it stayed with me, his performance of I Won't Forget You, because it was just like a show-stopping moment. I thought, wow, this is pretty amazing. And that's why I didn't know about the events of November 19th, 1983 till well later. Nothing got reported in the American rock press. And I would read Rolling Stone, Circus, Cream at that time. It wasn't until Trouser Press did something months later. And I remember my heart stopping when I saw that. I couldn't believe it.
As strong as the music was and as tight as all the performances were, was there anything that did feel off emotionally with Tom? Or?
Not at all.
Yeah.
And I've met plenty of people of note, plenty of famous rock musicians. And I'm not saying this to inflate myself. It's just through doing the show and just through life, going to see bands and, meet and greets and things like that. But without a doubt, the moment after the show, waiting my turn to shake Tommy's hand and get his autograph was the most hands are shaking moment I've ever had in that situation before. I don't know why, just recognizing I'm standing before the guy that's saying, come and get it, and Rock of All Ages, and believe me, and it's over. All that history was there. And I remember he had heels on his shoes, but I was still taller than him, which I thought was kind of funny in hindsight. But he was wonderful. He was gracious. And I remember Bob had said in the show when I had my conversation that was a really fun group. And that was the sense. It was like these guys were fun. It was loose. They just seemed to be having a great time. It's crazy that I missed them the earlier times they played there in '82 because I devoured that stuff. And maybe I was busy that night or whatever, but I would have taken every opportunity.
Yeah.
Now, subsequent to that, when Joey started coming around, I think I saw probably a dozen shows, and they were all over the place. Mike was with them sometimes. Jerry Shirley was with them sometimes, and then the band seemed to stabilize around Mike Leachy, and there was a guy named AJ in bass and John Richardson on drums. And I saw them probably more than any other lineup. And then eventually Mark Healy was on bass as well. And it was at some point, I want to say in '89, at some show they did, was where I got the idea of the fanzine. And I hung out after the show. And either I gave them my number or he gave me theirs. But the next thing I knew, I was talking to Kathy, who was
Wow.
not there. But that's how that started. She was basically the gateway to, all right, you want to do this, let's discuss what your intentions are and how you're going to do it.
Very cool. Had you had any experience building a community like that or anything with the Beatles up until that time, or?
None whatsoever. But I think what I came to recognize is that there was a hardcore base of regulars that would show up at every Badfinger gig. And it's like, oh, this guy's got a bunch of video. This person has this connection. It's like, it seemed like before we knew there was such a term as crowdsourcing, like there was a core community that would support this if we wanted to do it. And certainly, I never ever saw a Badfinger gig where the place was packed. There was always people turning out, no matter what it was. And I can remember having to drive like to these communities I'd never been to in my life outside of Chicago where they were getting booked. These bars, and the shows were always great and they satisfied. If you wanted to go there, hear the Dreamer live or stuff off of Joey's Earth Tone album and whatever else, they absolutely were fantastic. You never went away thinking, oh shoot, why didn't they do this, why didn't they do that? But it was kind of odd that the lineup was constantly evolving by the time I was seeing them regularly. That, oh cool, that's Mike Gibbons. And it was super exciting, things you never thought would happen, and they did.
Yeah, that is very cool. And obviously, you're kind of at the epicenter too. Once Joey's in Minnesota, there it is probably a day's drive away from most of the shows. So you kicked off the idea for it. How do you go from the vision of like, let's kick off a fanzine to the actual day-to-day implementation of it? Did Kathy have any rules you had to follow?
No, nothing like that. And she was like all about, I'll open whatever doors I can for you. Let me know what you want to do. A lot of it was like right out of my own collection of like photocopied articles, that it was all about photocopying. And I remember, the whole thing I look back at is well-intended, incredibly naive, that because you didn't have access to information, it was all as good as the people you talked to or whatever you were able to dig up and then photocopy and share. So no background or experience with this. I'm not a great joiner of clubs at all, but I figured it was justified enough to do because number one, I wanted to do something good for them. I thought that this is a worthy use of my time, that people are into it. And there was no end game. I had no real thought in mind of where this was going to go. But, that we were two members down at that point, and Joey was touring a lot and Mike would pop up from time to time. So I thought as long as they're out there, there will be an interest in this sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
But then it got too big past a certain point.
Yeah.
I've alluded to this, I think, in the newsletter that I do for the podcast. It got beyond our scope to deliver, and we shut it down.
Well, what was that arc like? So I'm trying to get the date. So I think he started it in the first issue would have been like 1990, and then was it to 92 or so?
I think so. That sounds about right. I think we were trying to do it as a quarterly. Ultimately, like what can we handle? What will justify itself? Also, it coincided with the Day After Day live album project being worked on, as well as the Pilgrim.
Yeah.
So that gave it all the more urgency and excitement that, hey, there's new product coming. This is good. Let's be on top of this and be the source for any information about this. Again, it's like if the internet had existed, it probably would have kept going a lot longer because we would have had the tools to reach people and share stuff instantly and not just steal away to the office, after hours to photocopy the stuff. And then later on, when that became unfeasible, we'd go to a local printer and have stuff printed. And what we were charging did not pay for the actual cost of things plus postage and all that stuff. So we were poorly organized and set up to do the job as professionally as it needed to be done. So that was another aspect. It's like, well, what's the end game for this?
Do you
But I will
remember
say
like
that
what was the peak like subscribership or anything at that?
probably a few hundred.
Okay, that's a lot. That's a lot to be mailing out.
Well, it is when you're hand stapling those issues and folding the covers and sticking them in envelopes and licking them and addressing them. Yeah, it was and it got to the point as soon as we knew that there were requests coming in that were laying unopened, people sending their checks and stuff because we just didn't have the time to do it all. It's like we can't do this anymore. And I alluded to this, and I don't know if this is speaking out of turn, but I'm going to say it anyway. There was somebody that Joey took on as a manager that suddenly wanted to seize control of it, that wanted to, okay, you have to write about this and this and this. We don't like the tone of this, and why you want to write about this, that's a waste of time. It suddenly, it was no longer our baby. There was an attempt made to morph it into a PR arm, and that wasn't cool with us. And so that was, we tried to sort of back out of it graciously. We did craft a final issue. I remember we saw the writing on the wall, so it wasn't like it just ended abruptly. We like said goodbye before we stopped doing it.
Interesting.
You're talking 30 years ago now. I'm just kind of
I know. Well, I don't know how often you think about it now, but I think it's amazing for a couple reasons. I mean, one of it is just like for me, it's right at the dawn of the modern era, right? Like it's just before I come along, but it's pre-internet. But the way that you're like the historiography, the way that you're capturing this band's detail and everything, it's a lot of the same challenges that we're dealing with today. And I read through it and I can empathize. I'm like excited about these projects as if they're happening. And like you said, a lot of it hasn't been documented. I mean, there's a lot of like Rolling Stones are, etc. on the initial releases of their albums or on Airwaves or Say No More. But the stuff you're covering in here, there's a project I was reading about where it says like Kathy and Marianne Evans are working on a photo, like a coffee table book. I'm like, what happened to that? I'm like, I'm reading through the pages trying to figure out like why didn't it happen, right? So it's critical, I think, as a source in some of the projects that were being considered at the time that didn't happen.
That's interesting. I'd forgotten about that too. You just mentioned it. Obviously, it came from somewhere. Yeah, that would be a good question to ask because I think clearly the interest is still there.
Yeah, and for the contemporary reviews that you're doing at the time, like you said, the Pilgrim. There's not a lot of press that I can find on the Pilgrim today. So when I read about it in the time, and you're going track by track, and I think you have one where Joey's talking about some of the sessions, and then he's going to Japan, and it just creates like a much more contemporary account of what was going on behind that album, and that's really valuable. He also, I think he mentioned he was shooting a video for "You Make Me Sick." What happened to that? Like just fell through the cracks of history.
That is interesting because even now on YouTube, there's not a video for "Too Late to Cry," but when I was at his house, he showed it to me.
But when you think back on it, was there any like particularly riveting story or interview that you did with any of the members?
Well, I remember when I did the phone interview with Bill Collins, and someday I may find the actual cassette of it. But even at the time, as naive and unpracticed as the stuff as I was, I felt he was being disingenuous and deflective, and he had a message he wanted to impart. About I think Bob even alluded to it. It's like he's coming up with this new teaching thing for keyboards and stuff like that. Yeah. He constantly wanted to impress, but any stuff of any real value, he was not very useful. And I remember in real time being disappointed by that. It's like, well, I'm looking for anecdotes. I'm looking for history, shed some insights or something like that. I never set out to be an interviewer. And it's funny that kind of where I ended up. But it was not a skill set that I had any ambition for. So I think I was thinking at the time, well, I'm glad Joe and Kathy set this up. I'm glad I have the opportunity to talk to him. He's really not giving us anything I want, but maybe somebody smarter than me will talk to him. That's kind of how I thought about it at the time.
That's interesting. That's a very interesting take. Is you did kind of overlap with. I mean, he lived a long time and was in some of those documentaries into the '90s, but I don't think there was anything else to mine there that he was going to share.
No.
Right? So.
No, definitely not. I don't think he lacks self-awareness. I think he knew a lot that he ultimately took to the grave. Not just, I'm not just trying to finger point and put culpability on him for his shortcomings that led them down the path they were down. But I think he is somebody that would have done well to write his own memoir, put down something
Yeah.
leave a trail of breadcrumbs because he had an interesting life.
Was there any interview ever that you wanted to do that your sponsors didn't agree with, or that you just didn't have the opportunity to pursue?
I remember thinking at the time it would be cool to talk to Ron Griffiths as somebody that would really cover the early part of their career because we never set out to just make this the Joey Mullen story. It just so happened. And even Mike, I remember there being talk with Kathy that, oh, we'll set up a call, but he's busy. I think he was living in Florida at the time or something like that. And I remember it being brought up, and it was like he didn't bite. Like either he had no interest or he was too busy or whatever. And just as a drummer myself, and as somebody that recognized what a strong writer he was, that, he's clearly a very musical guy. He wasn't just the fourth member. There were things to talk about. I would love to have heard his insights into his own songwriting or productions of stuff. And there was a tear in a while before he died where he was putting out stuff fairly regularly,
Yeah.
a stream of product that, in fact, the last time I saw him was at the fest, um, late 90s, early 2000s, whenever it was that he was going around. When he died in 2005, 2006. Yeah, so it would have been within 5 years, I think, before that. And he was signing his CDs of the product he had at that time.
Mhm.
It would have been nice to have that conversation with him because, talk about a guy that I don't think I've ever seen an interview with him anywhere by anybody at any time.
It's similar to I mean, the Beatles, everyone recognizes they all had very different perspectives. And now we have, these four movies coming out that really just pay tribute
Right.
to the idea that you can't cover it in one movie. But with Badfinger, they always tried to do it in one. Right? We never really acknowledged that same, I think, framing that exists within each member. So,
Joey and Kathy invited us to spend the weekend at their place back at the height of this stuff. And I took pictures very sparingly because I thought, I'm a guest in somebody's house. I'm not going to, this is their private time, their private space. I'm not going to make them feel like they have to be on. I did take a few, and I need to find them because now, Joey's gone and Kathy's gone. It would be cool to revisit that. But I never like posed. Well, I take that back. I think there's a picture of me that got published in the fanzine of me with the band, with Mark and John and Mike.
I saw
And I
that.
remember the caption, unidentified hanger on. So that exists. Now, as I'm thinking about it, I remember Mike, the lead guitarist, the guy who plays on You Make Me Sick,
Mhm.
was holding a Coke bottle inappropriately in the picture when the picture was taken.
Everyone who's watching is a huge Badfinger fan, but we love them as people too. And I think that combination of kind of humility and just the way they treated their fans. So I'm curious, when you visited Joey and Kathy, what are your memories of them as people?
That, I know just from being around and seeing online discussion that there's people that found Kathy a hard person to warm to. She was never anything but kind and sweet and frank and wonderful. She did everything you wanted her to be. She made you feel like you were her friend, and she would do things for you. And I just remember she loved talking on the phone. Again, maybe in a later era we'd be emailing or texting back and forth, but back then it was phone conversations, and she was great about that. I remember being at their house. They had cats. I remember Joey showing me video he had of Badfinger. That's where I saw the Too Late to Cry clip was right at his house. But I remember the greatest picture I never took. I saw it in the moment and I just didn't do it. It was Joey 1991 with the big glasses he was wearing in the house. And he was sitting right in front of the TV because he was sort of managing the tape. So he was literally on the floor in front of his TV where the clip of Come and Get It from Beat Club was being shown. And there was a close up of Joey in 1970. And there's Joey, 1991. I wanted to take my picture of the two Joeys right at that moment. And I didn't do it. The moment was gone. I think about that to this day, but it was really a sweet moment. And then I remember once we were done with the Badfinger stuff, he wanted to watch a movie. The movie we watched was The Craze. There was another time when he had a supply of like promotional copies of the Day After Day gig, the live album gig, that he wanted me to give out to fans through the fanzine and do a giveaway. And after a gig, went to his hotel room. He had them with him. He signed them all. He personalized every one of them different because we didn't have the winners yet. He would write like whatever non sequitur popped into his head, and he gave them to me, and those got given out to the fans. And I remember the last thing he said before I left that day was, "We really appreciate what you're doing. Don't ever, don't ever doubt it." And I thought that was like, it was so cool, so gracious. And as I mentioned in the newsletter, when he found out I was going to England in 1991, he goes, "Where are you going? When are you going?" He calls up his brother Frank in Liverpool. He goes, "Frank will show you around." And so I met Frank and Ethel Mulland, and they were the ones that showed me Liverpool back before there was a Forthland Road and a Mendips and all that stuff. I don't even know if there was formal Beatle tours at that point, but it was really cool to get a Liverpudlian's trip around Liverpool, showing me where the Mullins grew up, and he goes, "And that's where the hedges were that Joey jumped out of and scared our mother," blah blah blah. Cool stuff like that. It was,
That's really cool. Yeah, before the tourist trap as well, that it probably is now with all the museums and everything. That's really
yeah,
special. Yeah, I mean, he obviously did care about his fans so much and always took the time to greet and talk to everybody afterwards and, invite, I mean, the first time I met him, yeah, invited me to get a pint with him and I was like, I'm not 21, but I would. Please give me another chance.
well, that was the cool thing, was when he passed and seeing this just explosion of acknowledgments of Joey on Facebook, and so many of them including the words "my friend,"
Mhm.
because that was absolutely how he made you feel. There was no, people will glom onto famous accomplished people all the time and go to meet and greets and have their picture taken with them, and they'll post that stuff. He absolutely made you feel like you were friends. He would converse with you, ask about your life and stuff. It's funny, through the podcast I've become friends with the Smithereens, and um, Jimmy was just telling me a story a couple of weeks ago when they passed through Chicago about Joey. We were talking about some gig where the Smithereens and Badfinger were evidently playing together. I don't know if it was as Smithereens or maybe some kind of all-star thing or something like that. And the story that's probably not fit for airplay that he told me, I could tell you later. It was just so funny. And Jimmy's like, "And there's my 16-year-old self thinking this is Joey from Badfinger." And he just said this. So it was hilarious. But that was the kind of guy he was. I think that Joey would definitely troll and play with your head if he thought you were being a little too worshipful. It was just a way of staying down to earth.
He never saw himself as the legend that he was, right?
He was as much a fan as we were.
Yeah.
Anytime we tell these stories about the work in the Imagine sessions or All Things Must Pass or something like that, he too was in awe. So he was like our seat at the table as far as that stuff goes.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I don't want to overhype his influence on any of us, but is it fair to say that that gave you some of the confidence and experience to then do the Something About the Beatles podcast down the road? Or maybe if you can briefly touch on
100%.
like how did that fanzine lead to your other projects?
100%, because the fanzine really, I think, besides the reasons we discussed of wanting to centralize history and communication and all that stuff when something like that didn't exist, at least as far as we knew. Looking at it in hindsight, I guess I was looking for a role to be a writer in, because there was part of me that would be reviewing albums in my head all the time. It's like, well, now I've got a place to put it, these great moments of, whatever happening. And so that led me ultimately, after the fanzine, I started writing books, and meeting somebody like a Joey and Mike and Jerry Shirley through that doorway that got opened through my fandom made it a lot easier to approach other people. Chris Thomas was another guy that I was so in awe of him for his entire resume. Worked on the White Album, it could be heard on the White Album, but also Procol Harum and Roxy Music and Pretenders and Pete Townsend and Badfinger too. So when I knew I was going to cross paths with him, as much as one can prearrange the will of another adult in advance, I want to sit down with Chris Thomas while I'm here in New Jersey. I want to have a conversation with him, ostensibly about the Beatles. But it's like, I'm thinking this might be the only time I get to talk to him. I'm wearing my "Wish You Were Here" T-shirt. I brought my "Wish You Were" album for him to sign, which he graciously did, and I started picking his brain about absolutely everything. And that was where I got the great line out of him about, I can't remember if this made the show, if this was off the air, but we're talking about the difference between the self-titled album and "Wish You Were Here." And he says, sometimes the difference between a good album and a great album is the track order. Well, who would know better than you? Yeah. So,
Interesting.
but for my connecting with Joey at a gig, but for meeting then Kathy on the phone, and then starting up this fanzine and having that sort of entree into a world that is a step beyond just normal fandom and buying the records. Yeah, I would say it absolutely gave me the confidence that maybe I have something of value that people will be interested in, and the artist will be as well once they recognize, hey, this guy could be a pipeline for getting a word out or celebrating our history and diving into it or whatever. But yeah, I would absolutely trace it back to that.
Yeah. From the No Matter What issues, that was the fanzine, and then after that, it kind of became like Web 1.0. I think by the mid to late 90s, it was like the Web Ring and Badfinger Boogie, and which I was kind of catching the end of. But I think it served as a really important bridge for fans to like you said, get some of that information.
Well, that was definitely intent, and I just think that given the resources we had, we did the best we could. I don't think it ever really took it as far as I would have liked to, but it just the timing was a little bit off. You're that close to the internet becoming a thing,
Yeah.
and all the difference in the world that would have made.
Just honored that you took the time, and I know you've got a lot of stuff going on a Friday afternoon, so it means a lot. And I hope we can stay in touch and kind of maybe find some other opportunities to collaborate in the future.
100%. Thank you so much for reaching out. That'd be great. That'd be awesome. Appreciate it.
Awesome. Yeah. Well, really enjoyed it. Great to meet you, Robert.
Great to meet you too. Thank you so much. This is a lot of fun.